Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome to all our participants from across the Americas, from Europe and beyond. My name is Jeff Passmore, and I'm happy to welcome you to the first in our series of 8 weekly Scaling Up Live webinars. A bit unusual this year, but we're going to be doing 8 one-hour weekly webinars every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern. This entire series of webinars is sponsored by our platinum sponsor, EcoStrat, North America's biomass supply chain experts. And today's webinar is hosted by BioTecanada, an industry-led consortium of companies, associations, and research institutions focused on using natural resources to accelerate Canada's transition to a sustainable, low-carbon economy. In case anyone has any technical difficulties or having any problems with the audio, please check your audio settings by clicking the audio button on Zoom. You may need to change your speaker settings. If you have a Bluetooth device connected, we recommend turning off the Bluetooth while on Zoom. And in the unlikely event we experience any major technical shutdown, a new Zoom link will be sent to you and a meeting will resume in 5 minutes. Just a few housekeeping notes. All participants are automatically muted and video capabilities disabled. The webinar is being recorded and you will be able to, all registrants will be sent the recording following the end of today's session. As to the panelists, if you're not speaking, it's probably a good idea to mute your microphones until it's your turn to present. And as to the participants, registered delegates, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box. Do not type them into the chat box. We will only be following questions that are in the Q&A box. If you need any technical assistance during this webinar, you can email the email address at the bottom, jshmershansky@ajw-inc.com. Now, speaking of our biodesign host, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce the chair for today's webinar, Jennifer O'Donnell, Executive Director of New Brunswick. Jennifer, over to you and your panel.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and good morning to everyone. I'm really honored to be moderating the first ever virtual session of Scaling Up. And today we're going to be hearing from 4 leaders in Canada's bioeconomy. The topic is whether Canada as a nation will transform into one of the world's leading bio-based economies, or will our country stand on the sidelines? My organization, New Brunswick, is part of the BioDesign Consortium. You can learn more about biodesign on the website canadabiodesign.com, where you can also sign up for the BioDesign Conference, which starts tomorrow. Many of BioDesign's activities over the past year have been about outreach and promotion. We want to build and grow a robust network of companies, associations, academic and research institutions from several sectors that are focused on the potential of Canada's bio-based resources for economic growth and for transitioning to a lower carbon society. And I really believe that this network of supporters has great potential to become a full-fledged innovation ecosystem for the bioeconomy in Canada. A national bioeconomy ecosystem could help create new and stronger value chains, lead to more anchor companies in Canada, and more Canadian products entering international markets. Along with the recommendations about growing this ecosystem, BioDesign produced a strategy report last year that recommended several actions that touch on things like more modern regulations, support for commercialization, better market access for bioproducts, and promoting the development of more Indigenous businesses in the bioeconomy. I hope that sets the stage for today's topic, and that our panelists will share how we can get off the sidelines as soon as possible. And with that, I'll remind you who our panelists are. Our first panelist is Sandy Marshall. He's from Bioindustrial Innovation Canada, which is a not-for-profit business accelerator for sustainable chemistry in Sarnia-Lambton and in Eastern Ontario. Our second panelist is Andrew Casey from BioTecCanada. BioTecCanada is the National Industry Association for Biotechnology, with over 200 members from health, industrial, and agricultural biotech sectors. John Hamel is our third panelist. He's from FPInnovations, which is an R&D organization that specializes in the creation of solutions for Canada's forest sector. Its R&D laboratories are located in Montreal, Quebec City, and Vancouver, and it has tech transfer offices across the country. And finally, our fourth panelist is Don Roberts from Nawitka Capital, which is an investment banking and advisory boutique focusing on the global clean energy and forest products industries. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Sandy Marshall as our first panelist.
Yes, good morning. Thank you. BioIndustrial, just to recap a little bit, BioIndustrial Innovation Canada is a not-for-profit business accelerator focused on creating jobs and economic value sustainably for Canada. BIC provides critical investment, advice, and services to early-stage companies with clean, green, and sustainable technologies. Our focus is on commercialization. BIC we also manage an agricultural research cluster focused on bioproducts, supported through the federal government and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. The industrial bioeconomy and its integration into the circular economy is also a priority for BIC and its biodesign partners. Next slide, please. So in 2019, Biodesign completed an industrial bioeconomy strategy, which is based on broad industry participation from across Canada. The strategy is built from the fact that in the global context, Canada has a significant competitive advantage through its access to large quantities of biomass. Canada has a wealth of riches, and it is the envy of most countries in the world. The strategy focused on the two significant pools of biomass available through agriculture and forestry. Although this was the focus of the strategy, it is not meant to ignore the opportunities available for macro-marine or municipal solid waste and resource recovery. Canada needs to focus on promoting the highest valorization of Canadian biomass and its residuals. By using best management practices and linking into the global circular economy, it allows us to achieve the objective of a reduced and sustainable carbon footprint, thereby supporting Canada's commitment to global climate change. The opportunity for Canada is staggering. In May of this year, the McKinsey Global Institute issued a report titled The Bio Revolution. And within it, it identified that in 10 to 20 years, a visible pipeline of biological applications could create approximately $2 to $4 trillion of economic impact per year. And interesting from this, more than half of that impact was projected to occur outside of human health and within the industrial bioeconomy. I think the most important point here is Canada now needs to act urgently to be part of this revolution. Canada needs to leverage the assets that exist in Canada through its traditional mature industries before these assets are lost. Today, the forestry and the petrochemical industry are under serious financial stress. Leveraging these assets to host biorefineries and to create markets, or to repurpose these assets to support the industrial bioeconomy are critical to reduce the demand on capital. The agri-food sector is focused on building an industry based on proteins. The industrial bioeconomy can enable the agri-food sector by providing added value to co-products and minimizing costs from its waste streams. The agri-food sector will be very competitive globally, and maximizing profitability will be essential for success. Next slide, please. So collaboration and building new commercial relationships will be required to succeed in this transformation. This quote from John Coyle, Vice President and General Counsel for Unilever Canada and co-chair of the Circular Economy Leadership Coalition, is a good place to close. We have an incredible resource available to us here in Canada. Let's not lose it, and let's get on with it. So thank you. Back to you, Jen.
Thanks, Sandy. I'll allow Andrew now to make his opening remarks. Over to Andrew Casey.
Thank you, Jennifer and Sandy, for opening that up. Perfectly done. I think I'll just pick up on the opportunity aspect here and think back 6 months ago where we were. And we were looking at a world that was headed toward 9 or 10 billion people, depending on whichever sort of prognostication you saw. We knew that we had to sort of figure out a way to re-engineer our economies, to live our lives differently. We couldn't keep going on the path that we were going. And then along came COVID. In March, things sort of took a bit of a detour. And now we sort of come out of this and start to look forward. And so when we were looking at this before COVID hit, there was an opportunity there. I think everybody recognized that, and certainly Canada was well positioned, as Sandy has outlined. We have all sorts of fantastic foundational elements in our economy, whether it's forest products, mining, oil and gas, all sorts of different pieces of that. But we were doing a fairly lousy job, I think, of coordinating all of our pieces. There was no strategy to sort of tie all these things together. And that was our fundamental challenge. And when you saw the economic strategy tables recommend similar things where you could sort of get together with a strategy, you could grow, scale it up, develop companies, that was, I think, a very important step forward. We were interrupted by the COVID, and here we are now some 6 months later, and we have to take a look at what's ahead. The one thing that's become fairly certain is that climate change has pretty much ignored the COVID virus. It doesn't really pay attention to that. And so it's continued apace. Our eye may have been taken off the ball a little bit by trying to deal with the COVID crisis. There's no question about that. But when we look at coming out of this thing, at some point in time, we will get back on track. And when that does happen, what are we going to be doing to rebuild the economy? It's fairly clear that some parts of our economy are not going to be coming back or will be very slow to return. And so as Canada sort of moves forward and tries to become more competitive in the world and grow its economy back to where it once was, what is it going to build that economy on? I think the bioeconomy is one of those areas that it should be looking strongly at. But again, if we go back to where we were before COVID, we didn't really have a really strategic approach to this. And I think this is where Canada's got to start to focus and really pick up that, recognize the important opportunity, the imperative of going forward with this and actually developing a strategy. Ultimately, what's going to drive this forward are two key pieces in my mind. We've got the innovation, we've got the industries here. So what else is going to be needed? It's going to be talent and it's going to be investment. And arguably, investment will solve everything. So we have to be as competitive as possible to attract that investment to make our sectors more competitive. And Canada's got to put out the welcome mat. I think we've done a fairly good job, but we can do better. We have to be out there. We're competing in the globe. We're looking for those investors to come from all over the world. We have to be a better nation that way. And that's where a strategy comes into place, a better regulatory process, and a more cohesive approach to supporting the sector. I think that that's ultimately where we've got to go if we're going to actually take advantage of this opportunity. Governments are turning their attention to it, whether it's federal or provincial, but they're going to have to sort of coordinate between themselves and also all the departments as well in terms of their policy approach. A more holistic approach to this is going to be what gets us there and attracts the investment and the talent we need to scale up and to grow anchor companies, which is ultimately got to be one of our most important objectives. I'll leave it there and pass it over to you, Jennifer.
Thanks so much, Andrew. We had a small problem with your connection there, but I think we caught all of it. We just lost you for a couple seconds, in case you were wondering. All right, I'd like to introduce Jean now to give us his viewpoint on the topic.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. That's okay. Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Andrew, for the and Sandy for the introduction. Here, just next slide, please. You know, I'd like to, we're talking about the being sidelined, and I took the analogy here of the highway, and if you can click on the animation. Okay, here, the way I see we see the transformation of the industry, I think that we need to look a little bit at history here. And if you look at where it started around in the year 2000, you know, there was a traditional kind of pulp paper, while the wood is still pretty good shape, but the traditional pulp paper was pretty challenged. And there was a recognition that these markets were, some of these markets were really a challenge and fading away. So there's been significant investment there Next, click on the next two animation. Thank you. So you saw with the in the last few years a lot of emerging new business model popping up, and companies like starting to explore different aspects of the bioeconomy in Canada. And there's been a flurry there. So are we on the transformation highway? I can certainly state that yes, we are on the highway. And here you see there's these different new models appearing. Traditional companies acquiring startup companies and technology, other joint ventures in all fields of the materials, chemicals, and fuels. Next animation. And thank you. So if you look at, if we're targeting, let's say in the next 10 years, there will be, if we're not being sidelined, really evolutions of for total, what I call total biorefinery here, which is the consolidation of the transformation. You'll see the new products being deployed and secure, as well as new value chain being established in all the fields of the bioresource, energy, fuels, chemicals, and materials, as well as Canada really need, and I'm referring back to what Sandy mentioned about the importance of maintaining assets in Canada, but there's still some pulp paper traditional markets that are enlarging and that are growing, like tissue packaging and some specialties products that could be used and could be augmented to maintain those facilities. So this is the map of this, but certainly a lot of these startup companies are face challenges, on markets, economics, financial aspects, and you might recognize some of these cases here that are listed. But most of these companies are on the grinder now to keep improving the value chain, developing the value chains, improving their value proposition of their product, as well as doing technical optimization to reduce capital costs and operating costs to obtain better economics. Next slide, please. So what do you need to stay on the highway? First of all, let's see, staying on the highway, we have to recognize that right now the Canadian industry, the forest product industry is changing directions anyway. In Eastern Canada, there's really a big unbalancing of wood versus wood chip demands created by the demise of the communication paper. In Western Canada, we have challenges of fiber availability due to the mountain pine beetle. However, there's still some available that are quite available biomass, which is underused. If you look at the last strategic document of Ontario, only 45% of available wood for harvesting is harvested. So which leaves about 30 million cubic meters of fibers available. The other point is that if we don't want to miss the curve, is to recognize the important market needs shift, and that are right now amplified by the COVID. We also have to recognize the increasing competitiveness on growing markets and opportunities that are the demise of communication paper, the plastic ban, carbon pressure, online consumer that creates as well as some pressures as well as opportunities. Well, whatever these directions, for the industry to survive, we need to have a really new balance of high value products and high volumes. There's no way we can survive if we're only aiming at high value, and also build new supply chain. My last slide, please. Here, I'd see, what can we do to avoid being sidelined on the highway? Well, again, maintain the traditional industry on these growing markets for economics, biomass access, and maintain the infrastructure. We also need to meet whatever products we have to meet market competition requirements, like providing higher performance to lower cost ratio, offer new features like biodegradability, applause competition, making sure we have enough supplies available of these new materials or chemicals, move faster than the intellectual properties to beat the competition, and be very active on the supply chain. And as these free markets, we need to play on the same ground as the free market competition is playing. We also need to recognize that because of the cost of feedstock, we need to, what I call, normalize the feedstock here by creating opportunities through fuel standards, mandatory biosource percentage into the products used by society, pushing, for example, for plastic bans to create some of the opportunity for the biosource materials. And also, one important point is to provide necessary hosting conditions that are relevant, for example, fuel standard, but that also stable and proportional to investment. For example, in biofuel, if you want to invest $1 billion for a biofuel plant, you need to make sure that you can secure for 20 years the biofuels. My last point here is that also like keep supporting the development, attracting the players around the value chain. So here, those are the factors, in my opinion, that are required to be addressed in order to avoid to be sidelined on the highway of the transformation of the industry. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Jean. And finally, Don Roberts, I'll invite you to give us your presentation.
Thanks, Jennifer. Good morning, folks. I'm going to really touch on three different topics here, but there's clearly one of the themes is the whole feedstock issue. And one of the points is that we really have to recognize there's a big difference between physical supply and economic supply. Yes, we've got a lot of, whether it's forestry, biomass, or ag residue, but at what price? And that's something you really have to nail down, because if we're going to come out and really take advantage of this opportunity at scale, I would argue that we're going to have to be looking at multiple feedstock strategies. And I underscore that by even just looking at what's happening south of the border right now, for example, where we've had a truly startling increase in the increases in capacity for renewable diesel. You know, quite literally, we had about 80 million gallons in 2010. It shot up to 400 million in 2018. And it's expected to be over 3 billion by 2022. That's according to the Fuels Institute. Now that's south of the border. And if you look at it, what's going to feed that? It's mostly lipids. So I would say, at what price are those lipids? You've really got to start thinking, and then the same story goes when you look at scale, whether it's the forestry, the ag, or down the stream, maybe it's going to be algae. So the feedstock is a big issue, especially when it's about 60% of your variable costs typically. So I would encourage, if we're going to do this at scale, look at multiple feedstocks and look in every waste basket or waste stream you can think of. And you're going to have to really sort of break out of our traditional industry silos to do that right. Second point is, aside from the feedstock, is get the right partner. You know, we have often people on the technical side who have come up with really cool technologies, and in many cases, they're painting a dream. But how do you make this dream a reality? So that, again, is hooking up with that feedstock supplier at scale who knows how to move biomass, and we do that well in Canada. We're good materials handler. We can move a lot of it. But then we also have to look at that other side, the offtake partner. And there, I would argue the only reason the offtake partners are there because they got a gun to their head. And that's usually because there is a low carbon fuel standard or some other incentive out there. Because right now the price signals are such that you don't go a low carbon bio-based food standard or a fuel option unless there is some kind of compelling reason. And so that means there's a role for government. Okay, so that's the third issue. We're not the only game in town. Yes, Canada's got a lot of opportunities, but as Andrew said, we have to compete for international capital. And here's just, you know, I'm an empiricist by nature. I want to see what the numbers look like. So let's just compare a couple of numbers here just to start the conversation. The first one is with regard to what kind of support we can get, for example, on cash flow for these projects. And I'm just going to compare the low carbon fuel standard credits in a couple of jurisdictions. If you look in the second quarter in BC, which is the only functioning one we've got in Canada, it was about $155 US a ton of carbon. So 155, that's pretty good. By the way, it kind of puts the carbon prices, this is a bit of a moot point. This is where the real action is in terms of price signals. You look down in California, which has been stimulating a lot of that renewable diesel, it's about 195 last week. And if you look in Europe, and this is one where people just don't totally appreciate right now, look at the German GHG reduction obligation. For 2020, the spread was from 450 US to 495. That's US dollars per ton of carbon. So there's different price signals out there. Europeans are pretty darn serious about this stuff. In Canada, at this point, at the federal level, we've got a process that's in place. Right now, investors essentially put zero value on it because we don't have enough information. There's too much uncertainty. But they're looking at maybe a cap on that of around, you know, $230 US, would be about 300 Canadian. In California, they've got a cap maximum of 200. And Germany, they've got a cap of $550 US. So again, it's interesting to see where you can sort of stress test this. That means that in a number of jurisdictions, we've got different price signals on cash flow, but we also have the other side is what are the supports on capital? And that's something where Canada's doing quite well, I think particularly in BC, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. But at the end of the day, when we're looking at putting some big capital into this, we'll look at what is our cash flow, what is our capital, and then what's our feedstock costs? And really go down and do the numbers. So those are just some food for thought, and I'll turn it back to you, Jennifer, and for some Q&A.
Thanks so much, Don. Okay, so for everyone who's been listening, please send us some questions in the question and answer window. We've got a few good ones here already, and we have a few planned ones as well. So as you think of them, type them in, and we'll try to get to them in the next half hour. Oh yeah, there's lots of new questions now. That's great. Okay. So I'll ask one question. So this question is, it says that a point was made a couple of times that Canada needs to take advantage of the bioeconomy in light of the incumbent forestry and petrochemical industry challenges. How is the federal government programming aligning to support this? Or I would rephrase that to, if you want to say, how should the federal government programming align to support these challenges? So, Don, how about you? I'll let you go first.
Sure.
Maybe follows up on some of the things you just mentioned.
Yeah, well, we've got a series of sort of initiatives at the federal level. Clearly, you know, John mentioned already what they're doing in the forest industry with FPInnovations. We've also got, I think, SDDC has played a very good, positive role at the earlier stages in order to get these technologies going. That's some good federal money. I would also argue, and this is again focused back on the forestry side, the IFIT, administered by the Canadian Forest Service, has been positive. Those have been solid. As well, we've seen for some of the bigger projects, the Strategic Innovation Fund, more by BioIndustrial. That's one which is very much structured. It's one of the biggest pots of money. It's been really structured around what is sort of the issue of the day for the government, though. And so it can run hot and cold as it relates to this sector. And it's often, you know, perhaps more political dimensions come into that. And then lastly, more on the debt side, generally, we've got the Business Development Bank as well as the EDC, Export Development Canada, who can provide some of that project finance. So we've got a number of I think, instruments in play. One of the things that, as I said, is a question mark still. I think there's a great potential, but we don't have enough details really yet, is the federal clean fuel standard. Because that is really looking at an LCFS at the national level, and it could be very powerful, or it could even create uncertainty for investors. For example, around what is eligible feedstock, you know, and that's important, not just these programs, but how we execute them. Because if we look south of the border, for example, with the renewable fuel standard, by their definition of forestry biomass, they've effectively ruled out the forest sector. Despite all the talk, they've effectively ruled it out. And so it's important to devil in the details and how we execute these things at the regulatory level. So a number of things we've done right at the Canadian level. As I said, you know, we could probably talk later, but I think arguably the most insightful clean fuel standard globally was developed in British Columbia. And that largely gets around their Part 3 agreements. Well, we can talk about that later.
Yeah, if we have time towards the end, I'd love to bring that up again. Maybe I'll turn to Sandy as well and pose the same question, especially around, he's asking about incumbent challenges around the petrochemical industry. Can you speak on any government programs, actual or forecasts that are aligned with that?
I guess, sure. I guess I'll kind of summarize this in what have I seen where the traditional petrochemical industry has reacted to some degree to policy, and there's two examples that come to mind. I would say it's too early to say that these are effective, and I totally agree with what Don has said. But one is the renewable fuel standard. From what we see, it's based on carbon intensity, which is the same basis as has been done in both, certainly California, and it's my understanding also in BC. And what we're seeing is that the traditional petrochemical industry is paying attention to a lot of the emerging biofuels companies, whether it be investment or support or discussions, because I think they recognize that driving to a lower carbon intensity through the standard will requires them to start looking for partnerships. And so we are seeing some activities going on there. I agree that we need to make sure that policy is set up appropriately so that it drives the right support structures. The second one I'll refer to is the waste diversion policies that are coming out, where we're trying to divert organics or other materials out of landfill. In particular here in Ontario, the Ontario government has been doing work around this space. And so what we are seeing is a lot of activity in the where those feedstocks are now becoming available to be used to produce other materials. A lot of cases, those are biofuels, bioenergy, and so on, but there's nothing to stop it from going to biochemicals or biomaterials as well. And I think the basis of what is happening there with the diversion policy is that it's actually putting a value or a negative value under waste streams that are currently going to landfill. And so it's driving organizations and municipalities to start looking at how are they going to deal with that. And it is creating an economic driver for feedstock pricing. So those are two examples that I'll use that I think connect into the petrochemical industry. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Sandy. I'll just give a minute to see if Andrew or Jean wanted to comment on that question. If not, I'll move on to the next one.
Yeah, I'd just like to add the, Jennifer, what the government can do also is for example, like recognizing the international collaboration that is required. A lot of these technologies are being developed all around the world, and making sure that we can have programs that can allow the collaboration and tapping into these instead of trying to replicate everything in Canada. I think that's not everything can be done in Canada. I think recognizing this would really be helpful. I'd like to go back to the point that I made when we discussed about potential partners. I looked at, for example, Neste Oil there. We had a discussion with them as they are partners of the Bell project. You know, they're looking for massive investment if the biofuel, renewable diesel projects would take off, and they're looking for $1 billion investment and more. You know, like, and that requires stability of all these programs, the fuel standard and so on. So I'm not sure how we can guarantee a fuel standard that will hold for 20 years or any other programs that would hold for 20 years, but that's certainly a major point that would be, that needs to be addressed or discussed openly in order to be able to attract those massive investment in Canada.
Thanks, Sean. Okay, I'm going to move on to another question because we have too much time and I'd like to get to some of these big questions. This question, let's see. The bioeconomy has so much going for it in terms of economic impact, benefits for existing industries, and contribution to environmental goals. And yet it doesn't seem to be on the radar screen of priorities for many of the low carbon initiatives being highlighted by government or environmental NGOs. How can we accelerate effective collaborative action? I think that's a great question. Andrew, would you like to address that question first? About how do we make the bioeconomy, line up better with the environmental initiatives that are going on?
Yeah, I mean, it naturally does. I think there's been a reluctance at certain points in its history for government to get too close to it because it was seen to be not aligned. But I think it's very clearly aligned. And I think what's going to happen now going forward is that the economic advantages of aligning it will become much more apparent to policymakers. Let's hope so, because that's where I think when those two worlds come together, we can actually make it work and develop the policy that's needed to support it. So that I see it happening somewhat naturally as we come out of this health crisis right now, where governments sort of understand the need for it, that it can be a huge part of the rebuild. But how do we get it there, and how do we track the investment? And back to the earlier question, I heard from at least 3 of the responses, the need to avoid uncertainty. And I think if we've got a regulatory environment, an investment climate that's got some uncertainty to it, investors will go elsewhere. And so we have to do a better job creating the certainty for investors so that they feel comfortable coming here with those investment dollars. Anytime you have a situation where it seems like we're skewing away from sort of supporting the sector, and whether it's for different reasons, that's what creates that uncertainty. So making sure that we're aligning our policy with where it's trying to go from a regulatory standpoint, but also from an investment standpoint, would be very helpful.
Thanks. Anyone else want to pick up on that question around collaborating between bioeconomy initiatives and environmental initiatives?
I just have one comment I think I would add to this is, as I kind of pointed out in my points, that the bioeconomy is embedded in so many parts of our Canadian industries. So it's an enabler for agri-food, it's an enabler for the forestry industry, it can be an enabler for the petrochemical industry. But by using the term enabler, it means that it's a supporter or helps each of those traditional industries to move forward. So when you start looking at where does the bioeconomy fit within the ministerial structure of government, it's kind of everywhere. And so we need someone to take a lead, and which to me, it gets back to ISED or the industrial ministries to do this, because it's the one that can pull them all together. Or the other option is to have very broad cross-ministerial relationships, which would be something that would be it is being done, but can be done more effectively.
Yeah, Jennifer, I'd also like to just say that if we're really going to want to engage the senior policymakers as well as the ANGOs, is we really have to quantify and then communicate what's our value proposition. Show how we can really move the dial here. And one of the areas, we talk about, putting new products, whether it's energy or materials. Other areas is that, I think one of the questionnaires that came up is, how about putting the value on stored carbon? I mean, that is an opportunity, particularly for the forest sector, and that could help move a dial, and also help in, certainly with the, make our domestic market more important for some of our forest products. So I think we have to be creative there, but you've got to put numbers out. Stop waving hands, put some numbers out, and show clear plan to do something and with milestones. And that'll engage people, I think, quicker.
Awesome. Yeah, it's interesting to hear across both questions that multiple panels have talked about breaking down the silos, and the frameworks we have may not, the bioeconomy doesn't fit neatly into them. So that's definitely a point to move forward with, I think. Let's grab another question here from the audience. Oh, kudos to Don. Kudos where they're due. Someone said you gave great commentary on federal programs. Let's see. What's the best way to get bioeconomy startups, investors, and end users to make connections to advance Canadian tech and get nature solutions, I'd say bio-based solutions to market? So can anyone speak about just operational kind of things that we can do as an ecosystem to bring together startups, investors, and end users to get things through commercialization? And I will call on one of you if no one volunteers.
Well, maybe this kind of fits into the role that BIC is inherent to what our mission and mandate is. Mm-hmm. And it really comes back to being able to create an effective network and linkages, because no one company can do things on their own. So you do need broad collaborations, and you do need tools in the economy that can support the building of those networks across. And that then comes back to the roles of associations such as Forestry Products Association of Canada, FPAC, or BioTechCanada, and Andrew's here. And it's also the role of business accelerators and incubators like BioNB and BIC. And I think if those are strategically put in place, they can provide the network to be able to create the connectivity. At the end of the day, our roles are limited in how much money and how many things we can actually provide financially into these systems, but the network and creating the networks is really critical, and we need to have a broad, effective network across Canada. And I think really biodesign is our our recommendation on how this can be coordinated across Canada.
Thanks, Sandy. I'd be interested in others' comments on the same question, but particularly to me is the investment piece. So what are some challenges there around attracting investment capital into the early stage part of the bioeconomy?
Just to pick up on some of this, I think I'm not so sure that there's a problem with our innovation and connecting with investors. I think Canada's proven that it's phenomenal at developing innovation. And look at Jean's presentation, where some of those Canadian companies have really taken this and are really driving forward some phenomenal ideas that are coming out of Canadian institutes like FPInnovations, but also our universities. I think our bigger challenge is scaling it to a place where we create companies. And the technology quite often gets developed here and then goes elsewhere, and because we've done a lousy job of bringing enough investment to this country to allow us to create the companies. And that's a fundamental challenge of the biotech sector, which is if you've got an idea and you're not able to attract investment to Canada, the idea is very mobile. It will go to where investment is, and we'll ultimately get the technology back in its finished form, but we will have missed out on all the economic benefits of commercializing it here. And so I think being better at commercializing here, creating the links, getting rid of the valleys that sometimes kill some of these companies early on, that's a role where government can play to sort of smooth that out, create the bridges so that we actually get to the end game where we've got actual companies here that are competitive and globally competitive and driving innovation into the global marketplace.
If I can just chime in as well on the investment side, you know, what I would say is that there's a lot of thought going into the sector globally. Yes, we've got some really good minds in Canada, but there's a lot going on globally. And so what I would say is when we're looking at creating these hosting conditions, let's get out of playing defense and go on the offense. And so what do I mean by that? You know, what's even to me a perfect type of thing to do is get a technology that was actually initially developed overseas with foreign taxpayer money and have the first commercial application in Canada. That's what I call a reverse Brazilian, because they essentially, instead of taking our technology and applying it down there, we do the reverse. You know, so I think, how do we do that? Structure it, because there's a lot of good ideas out there, and to have them implemented. And it gets back to, again, leverages our strength, like on the biomass. One of the interesting questions, and I think people don't realize, again, is how much capital you have to spend before your final investment decision is made. And typically, if you look at a proven technology, you're talking about, 15, maybe 20%, before you actually even decide you're going to do it for sure. Now, that's with a proven technology. When it's not proven, a first of a kind, you could be talking 25%, even 30%. That's huge investment uncertainty. So that is one of the areas where there is a role for government. I think, for example, the IFIT does a good job. The Part 3 agreements do a good job. That's less well suited probably for the Strategic Innovation Fund. But those are things you have to sort of say, what is unique about actually getting steel in the ground here to create low carbon products? And I think by focusing on really where the vulnerability is, and then quite frankly, the assistance probably is needed more on the capital side than on the cash flow side. And that has implications on what levers you push. For example, whether it's through the tax system or more for direct intervention. So anyway, just throw that out. Obviously, if this were easy, we would have done it already.
Yeah, Jennifer, if I may add also to this, you know, like, you know, I've been witnessing or being part of a lot of the adventures in Canada over the last 15 years and the technology investment. And you know, as an engineer, I think we can resolve a lot of these issues. So you really, where a lot of these companies that, many of them that I showed on my slide, where they're really struggling is getting integrated into value chain or selling the product, just plain said. You know, even the drop-in solutions are not necessarily that easy. So that's, in order to make this happen, you know, like investment and patience needs to be there to promote and help support the application side and development of these applications. You know, like the IFIT program is fantastic in Canada because that gave a lot of investment to build a lot of the plants to produce enough materials or chemicals to be tested in the market. If you look at BioNB, for example, they were like really the challenge was to really create, they had a product that was competitive performing, but the value chain was not building fast enough there. And that's one of the places where we really need to pay attention in Canada, is investing into the patience that needs to be there for the value chain building, which should not be underestimated here.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to move on to a different kind of topic. There's a couple questions here I'm going to combine around the market pull for the bioeconomy. So feedstock availability is of course important, but also creating high value products is part of this. So the first question, the first attendee is asking what high value products are most likely to drive the bioeconomy. And another question is around how the consumer can be engaged in the bioeconomy. So if consumers are looking for products of the bioeconomy, renewable products, bio-based products, biofuels, we need more of that to drive this and to get off the sidelines and get on the highway that John started. Yeah, I was looking for your comments on the consumer, the end user's role, and how can we have more of that pull on this industry, so the industry grows because the market is demanding it. Sandy, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, this is a very difficult challenge. You know, we've been funded for a number of years to try and support early stage companies, and what we're finding now is probably the biggest challenge is trying to get products into the market, as Jean has said. And it's interesting that we hear that consumers are all very interested in having the products, yet we also in the next sentence say, well, there is no green premium. So what is causing the traditional industries or the traditional distributors of products, whether it be the Walmarts, the Canadian Tires, Loblaws, and so on in Canada, what's causing them to change their behaviors and start to pull these products through into the markets? And there are parts, I believe, that are coming from the consumers. But my sense is that these organizations, some of them are taking it upon themselves through their own sustainability strategies and their long-term vision. I think in a lot of cases, these companies like Canadian Tire and Loblaws are actually driving the change more so than coming directly from the consumers' willingness or forcing them to change. I believe if the consumers step up the pace, there'll be more reaction from the companies. But right now, I believe the companies are taking part of that burden, and they're moving cautiously, but they are moving. And you certainly see it from the quote from Unilever and from some of the other partners that are part of the Circular Economy Coalition.
Thanks, Sandy. John, do you have any thoughts on that, especially from the forest side? So what is going to make more market pull on these bio-based products?
You know, I don't want to be provocative here, but you know, the thing is, you know, when managing the researcher, one of the first questions that yeah, the green aspect is very important, but you need to make products which has a superior value proposition, or at least equal to the existing products that you want to replace. And even then, there's a premium to pay because there's a risk to be taken for the market to take new products that would be having similar function here. But when you start looking, what start emerging now is that you see products that have, if we have established the right value chain, that will have superior value proposition. So this is what I was referring to, the free market, you know, requirements. Is value proposition, is either cost, is either new features that you can add to your products that are needed there. The green or the environmental impact, we can only save the world if we can convince the world that these products are as equal or better performing than the existing products. And you see a lot of them that's starting to emerge there that create these, for example, on the biodegradability, you know, like a compostability of plastic, you know, if there's a cost at the other end of disposal of plastic, which overcomes the price that you have to pay the premium to produce these materials, I think we're gonna have a winning market there. If not, you know, let's see, just on the green aspect, everybody is ready to save the planet and consume these green products. But when it comes to buy it, you know, quite often the wallet still has a lot to say in the decision.
Absolutely. Andrew, do you have any thoughts on how we can drive this market pull?
Can't we just talk about solving peace in the Middle East? It's easier. Well, just to pick up on one part of the question, which is, you know, which products should we focus on? I'm not so sure we should focus on products. I think we should focus on probably sectors or industries and let them decide which of the products are going to be most viable out in the global marketplace. And when you look at our sectors and industries, we've clearly got some advantages there that was talked about, whether it's forest products, in other sectors, oil and gas, the mining sector. You know, we have a long established foundational set of industries there. And so if we sort of look at those, figure out how to make them more competitive by moving into the bioeconomy, supporting their structures and supporting the innovations into those sectors, then I think we're in a better place. We'll let those sectors decide which of their products are the ones that are going to be most viable out in the global marketplace, though.
Awesome, thanks. Don, you ready to move on to the next question? Or you want to talk about the market?
Myself?
Ready?
Well, one thing that I just say is that there's just such huge uncertainty. You know, if you would have gone back 6 months ago, and what was the really exciting topic among people who wanted to get projects up in the space, it would probably been things like jet fuel, right? You know, no one else could do it. Can't have an extension cord going up in the sky. That changed with COVID, right? So even something that which you think has a sure bet on the demand side, now it's a question of uncertainty. So one of the things that you have to bear in mind that when you get into really the micro questions about what specific product I'm going to produce and where, it's tough for anyone in a central body to do. And I would say, just don't do that question. Instead, what I would also say though, is that, so how do you handle this uncertainty? And as we move the ball down the field here, is look for products that give you optionality. Really look at that. And so, for example, what do you mean by that? I would say, for example, bio-crude oil. You can make bio-crude oil. Essentially, it's taking it, you're liquefying wood, or ag residue, or another kind of biosolid. Once you've got that, I can pivot in a number of different directions. Yes, indeed, there's a lot of incentive if you've got a low carbon fuel standard to go into an advanced biofuel. But is that your end game? I would argue that that would be fine, but who knows, maybe those regulations will even change over time. So, but once I've got that capacity up and building and I can produce this at scale, I can show I can do it, then you start pivoting into the biochemicals. And if that isn't quite where you want it, and that's a huge area, you pivot to another direction towards biomaterials. So there's an area in which we have to do this fundamental transformation that I think we still have to do, which is then going to open up a lot more possibilities. And if I can give a story to investors that I've got optionality and I'm not just, you know, tied to one specific product, which is subject to regulatory risk, which by the way, is what gives me the most indigestion these days, then that's what I would probably be doing in order to access the capital.
Okay. There's another question that just came in that sort of touches on what you were just saying about the diversity of products we can make. But the question is, the competition, even within green options, must be considered. Have you ever heard of electric cars? It will likely be biopower or wood pellets being the main component of power generation. So to achieve value, are we left with a materials play? Are we not?
Well, first of all, you don't get into ethanol if you're going to do wood, right? Why? It's because ethanol primarily goes into the smaller, vehicle traffic. So that's the one which is most susceptible to things like electrification. If you look at long transport, heavy transport, far less risk due to that particular sort. So the bottom line is that we should be looking at a number of different areas. What I would say is that in general, there are a lot of very cheap alternatives in the form of green electrons. If your strategy is to use biomass for electron, look for another business. It's a defensive play. It's not going to, you're too many threats if you just look at the levelized cost of electricity. That's not where you want to be, except if you're a very specific combined heat and power type of application, probably. So pick your spots what's unique about us, and I'd also like just to go back, and I'll try to be controversial here. I think a comment was made earlier that maybe on the regulatory side, to make sure that we use a lot of bio, is that we should have, say, minimum bio content. I would say that's the wrong approach. Why? It's because, is that really what you care about, or is that a means to an end? If what we care about is low carbon intensity, focus on that. And I don't care how you do it. But what do we really care about, as long as it's sustainably done and we hit our targets? But I think this is something that, again, we have to be careful as we look beyond our sort of silo, is bio, while it could be a very competitive option, is it your only option? And let's not confuse ourselves with what society really needs. And hopefully now someone will throw a dish at me or something, but.
Virtually.
So Jen, I have just one little quick comment to the, say, focus on biomaterials. My comment to that is, it's a portfolio play. You can never focus on one and say it's the one. Chemicals can be platform chemicals. There will be a hierarchy of value, and we need to be taking advantage of all of those different parts of it to maximize the value of any of these systems. That's how the petrochemical industry got to be as dominant as it is today. And Don's example that he used earlier was how the petrochemical industry became so powerful and successful. And so we should look at that model and not say that it's wrong, just leverage the model, but use it with a different feedstock portfolio.
Thanks, Sandy. I'm going to move on to another question unless anyone jumps in quickly on that last one. No? Okay. So this one's about regulations. The question is, would you consider clear and predictable performance-based regulatory regimes a good stimulant to attract more investment in the bioeconomy versus other countries? So I think they mean, is that something that we have now in Canada? Is it an advantage, or is it something that's needed? Again, around predictable, clear regulatory regimes for products in the bioeconomy. I'll pick someone to go first. How about Andrew?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that we have a very good regulatory system in Canada. It's actually a competitive advantage in many cases. Can it be improved upon? Yeah, absolutely. But you wouldn't want to do so at the risk of becoming less stringent, or at least less scientifically based. So you want to make sure that it stays fairly rigorous, but can it be streamlined a little bit faster, a bit more transparent? Absolutely. When I think about some of the companies in BioTechCanada's membership, as an example, Okanagan Specialty Fruit, I think they were able to get regulatory approval in the US a year before they could get it in Canada, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. This is where I think we can be a lot faster and be more competitive. And again, back to the earlier point around attracting investment, if we've got a regulatory system that is efficient, effective, and scientifically based, then you're able to be a bit more effective at attracting investment and advancing your innovation further down the road.
Thanks. Anyone else have comments on the regulatory aspect of this, and whether it's a detractor?
I don't want to belabor it, but yeah, I have a strong view on this one. Right now, with the market signals coming out of very depressed oil prices, and we're going to have it for a long time, you've got to have, given that backdrop and the fact that we've got a disconnect between the public and the private cost of carbon, is that what makes sense? So how do you respond to this? You can price carbon, but we know we can't politically make a high enough carbon price to make that work. That's just nowhere in the world are they doing that. And so then you can go the straight regulatory route saying, thou shalt do this. The problem with that are the inefficiencies. So again, I think the compromise that we've seen develop, started in California, now in BC, now in Europe, are these, quote, smart regulations, where they're focused on a particular end goal, and then they designated the heavy polluters as the obligated parties, and they then must take different activities in order to decrease their exposure. And you do that through a market-based system. Do not, repeat, do not try to be too prescriptive with regard to the technology. Focus on the outcomes, let the innovators do their thing, and again, have the polluter pay. What's interesting about these, quote, sort of smart regulations is that it's the polluter paying, it's not public treasury. Bear that in mind, because one of the things I think we can all get a consensus on is that governments are broken, becoming more so. And so you have to take some pressure off them. So it's a, quote, smart regulation. I think we've got a pattern. Already people have done the heavy work in terms of how to figuring some of this stuff out. So it's a question of implementation now.
Thanks, Don. We've only got a few seconds left. I want to let Sandy or John weigh in on that question. I don't want to cut you off, but okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. I'm going to hand it back to Jeff for some wrap-up comments on this panel. But thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you very much. What a wonderful panel and what a great discussion. And thanks, Jennifer, for leading that discussion and managing all the great questions we had from participants. But sadly, we've run out of time. That's all the time we have for today. I wish we could continue this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I want to thank you, a really big thanks to today's session host, BioDesign. And again, thanks to our panelists and thanks to the audience for attending. Please note that next week's webinar will be talking about project finance and insurance and how to enable the biocircular economy through such project finance and insurance. And that's going to be September 15th, and it'll be hosted by Munich Re, the world's largest reinsurance company. So this is Jeff Passmore signing off. See you next week. Bye for now.